to you. Hopefully you've begun those MARC grants. So thank you. I'm here with our wonderful host, NJIT, and also my fellow TAB providers across the country here to present Enhance Your Chance, What You Need to Know to Be Competitive in the FY23 EPA MARC Grant Competition webinar. There's a mouthful, right? But we're going to hopefully digest a lot of stuff for you today. The goals, basically, you're going to hear a lot about special considerations. There's been a lot of changes in the guidelines. So on each one of them, so that's the MARC, the Multipurpose Assessment, Cleanup and Revolving Loan Fund. You're going to hear hints, writing each section, narratives and ranking criteria, and also, of course, available tab assistance for grant writing from each of the regions. And some of the ground rules, housekeeping, all right? So pretty much the speakers will be muted during the presentation, everyone but the speakers, sorry. But if you have questions, please use the Q&A. We'll be trying to answer those continuously. If you're having any technical difficulties, awesome, Dan Livingston is here to help you. There's his email address and he can assist you. I already talked about the Q&A, just address it to everyone. And we're going to try to answer as many of those questions so that we can keep moving through a very long list of things, but we're just so excited to give you so much in such a short period of time. So a recording though will be, of the webinar will be available along with the slides at this address at ksutab.org. So that's Kansas State University TAB website. And we definitely value your feedback, so please respond to the post-webinar evaluation questions, okay? So without further ado, you're going to hear from 5 presenters, including myself. I'm with CCLEAR Region 10. I'm a senior planning consultant with CCLEAR. Carrie M. Staten, she is the director of the Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center. She covers Region 3. And of course, I'm not going to go through these bios. You can go through them when you get the slides. Kaylin Bruno is with NJIT Region 2. She has 16 years in environmental industry, experience in lots of things. And Beth Grigsby is a licensed professional geologist with over 30 years of experience. She covers with KSU 5, 6, 7, and 8 regions. And rounding out our team is Dr. Nefeli Bompati. She's with Region 1, and she's the Assistant Research Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Connecticut. So our speakers, if you combine all that experience, is well over 50 and probably even 100 years. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Carrie to talk about considerations for each type of the grant applications. Hi, Carrie, and I will pass the baton to you.
Thanks, Joelle. Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Staten. As Joelle said, I'm with WVU TAB, which is the TAB provider for Region 3, the Mid-Atlantic. And I'm going to give you the quick overview on all of these MARC grants and some quick highlights. There's a lot of information on my slides. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's good information to refer back to later, and we'll mostly focus on the key pieces and things that maybe are a little bit different from previous years. Next slide. All right, so the eligibility of applicants for all grants, as you can see, basically any unit of government, including regional councils or redevelopment agencies, which may be quasi-governmental or sort of arms of different government agencies, many nonprofit organizations, and as I said, quasi-governmental organizations. You can look into the guidelines for more specifics on some of the nuances for different kinds of organizations, and you can always, for all of the things you're going to hear today, double check things with your TAB provider, or they can help you connect with the regional EPA folks for you as well. So for all of those grants, there's going to be some different eligibility as well related to applying for multiple applications. So EPA put out one of my favorite tools this year, these 2 charts. The first one tells you about your eligibility to apply for multiple applications. So if you go down the left side and pick which one you know you're applying for and follow the row, you can see if you're also eligible to apply for a different kind. And then on the next slide, you can see if you're a current grantee or have had a grantee in the very recent past, it will tell you if you're eligible for new grants this year or to participate as part of coalitions, different kinds of coalitions this year. So we won't walk through all of that, but it's very useful sort of cheat sheet. So the first grant, I'm not going to go in the MARC order because MARC makes a really great acronym, but I prefer to kind of talk about them in the increasing capacity required to apply. So first off, assessment grants. There are 3 kinds of assessment grants this year. Community-wide, which are the most common. You can apply for up to $500,000 this year, and they did change the period of performance from 3 years to 4 years. They once again this year, for the second time, we have community-wide grants for states and tribes. So only recognized federal tribes and state agencies are eligible to apply for up to $2 million over a performance period of 5 years. And coalition grants are back this year for up to $1 million with some significant changes in eligibility. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And those are also over a period of 4 years. And for all of these assessment grants, you can do a number of activities, including creating inventories of brownfield sites, characterizing and assessing those sites, a number of planning activities, including revitalization planning, feasibility studies, site-specific planning, and reuse planning, and of course, community involvement for all of those activities. These are estimates. EPA is anticipating giving 20 coalition grants across the country this year, 61 community-wide assessment grants. They will be looking to give more to new recipients. So EPA is really interested, from what we're hearing, in funding new organizations, new areas of the country that haven't gotten funding before or haven't gotten it for some time. And they expect about 17 state and tribal grants. Important to note that these are all estimates, but it gives you a sense of sort of how competitive the field is and how many grants you can expect to see awarded in the spring. So some quick update or highlights on assessment grants. Only 1 application per state, tribal, or city government. So whether you're applying for a community-wide assessment or if you're eligible for state or tribal grants, only 1 part of your state. So the Department of Environmental Protection can apply, but then also your Department of Economic Development cannot also apply. For these purposes, you're considered a single entity. Same goes for a city government. So only one department at a time can comply. Applicants that are eligible for the state and tribal assessment grants have to decide whether they're going to do one of 3 kinds of assessment grants. So they can apply for one of 3: a regular assessment, a state and tribe, or join a coalition. And as I said, for those state and tribal grants, only 1 per state. So they're only going to consider 1 per state. Next slide. All right, administrative costs are allowed up to 5% of the requested funds. This is true for all of the grants and has been the case for several years now. Assessment grants do not require cost share. And if you do not currently have an assessment grant or a multi-purpose grant, you just need to make sure that you say that. So a good rule of thumb for all of the grants is if there's a question, even if it doesn't apply to you, you should say specifically, directly, this does not apply to me, rather than skip it, just to be sure that it's clear to the reviewer. And if you do have a current assessment grant, you must meet the 70% drawdown in order to be eligible for new funding this round. All right, so some other highlights on the state and tribal grants. This is only the 2nd year that these have been offered. So eligible entities include states, Indian tribes other than in Alaska, including the Intertribal Consortia, and also the Alaska Native Regional Corporation, Alaska Native Village Corporation, and Metlakatla Indian Community. Communities and colleges and universities, even public ones, are not eligible for this. They are eligible perhaps under other opportunities, but not for state and tribal. In this, you do have to identify at least 3 target areas and 5 priority sites, and make sure that at least 1 site is in each area. You need to include a mix of metro and non-metro, so urban and rural. Make sure you're highlighting those disadvantaged communities and those with a lack of capacity to apply for a grant on their own. These grants are reviewed in competition only with each other, so it does not go into the bigger pool of other community-wide assessment applications or coalition applications, and you must assess at least 10 sites over your 5 years. Again, they're really stressing that you should target those disadvantaged communities and communities with a low capacity, and you are not subject to the 70% drawdown requirement if you have, for example, just a regular community-wide assessment from the last couple of years, you can still apply for this even without meeting that requirement. And you have 12 pages for your narrative as opposed to the traditional 10 pages. All right, so coalition grants are back, as I said. Some changes just to highlight quickly on those coalition grants. The funding cap has been increased from 600,000 to 1 million. At least 2 sites must be assessed in every member's boundary. This used to be only 1, and your target areas cannot overlap. So your coalition members have to be covering different target areas so that you're building a broader geographic area. Very key issues that I know I've been getting a lot of questions about in Region 3. A non-lead member cannot be affiliated with the lead member. So the way a coalition grant works, and you'll hear a lot more about this later, I think, is that there's a lead member and then there are a number of non-lead members that are signing on to that. The lead member is responsible for applying and ultimately submitting all the reports and works in coordination with a memorandum of understanding with the non-lead members. But your non-lead member cannot be affiliated with your lead. So for example, if you're sort of like an associate, a national or a regional association of groups, and you have more localized groups that are all under your sort of umbrella, only one of you can be a member of the coalition. Non-lead members cannot apply for any other community-wide assessment grants on their own in this cycle, or have had one of those since 2015. And that's a big change. So in the past, that was not a requirement, but they're really looking for higher capacity groups to be lead applicants and help along the lower capacity groups as non-lead members. So if you have had a grant or you currently have a grant, then I would suggest that you look into applying for a grant on your own rather than joining a coalition as a non-lead. And there will be fewer points awarded to applicants if your funding does not include at least one lead coalition member that is a community-based organization, as opposed to, for example, to another government entity. Moving on to cleanup grants. Cleanup grants can be used for cleanup activities as well as reuse planning, community involvement, other related programmatic expenses, health monitoring, environmental insurance, and monitoring of institutional controls. Also note that there is a community notification requirement as part of your application for a cleanup grant that is not required for the other types of grants. There is some slightly different nuances to applicant eligibility as opposed to the others, so I would strongly encourage you to look at the guidelines to be sure that you are falling into the right entity, and we'll talk about ownership eligibility in a minute. Once again, this year, there will be no cost share requirement for cleanup grants. Historically and traditionally, there is a cost share requirement, but as the funds are still being awarded under the infrastructure funding from Congress, there is no cost share requirement on any cleanup grants this year. All of the cleanup grants for periods of performance have been changed to 4 years, and they anticipate giving a total of 73 grants. Next slide. In order to be eligible, in addition to meeting those organizational eligibility requirements, you do have to be the owner of the site at the time of your application, and you must have conducted all appropriate inquiry prior to acquiring the property, and not be liable in any way for contamination at the site or affiliated with anyone that is liable for contamination at the site. If you're not sure about this, you need to get on it right away, and this is something that TAP providers can provide answers and assistance on for sure. A new threshold criteria this year for cleanup grants only is an additional request in the letter that you ask for from your state environmental authority. You have to show that there's been sufficient site characterization from performed to date or will have been performed before June 15th of 2023, and that's a determination that must be made by your state environmental authority. To be sure that you're getting all the right information to your relevant state authority in time, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to them right away just to make sure that they're aware of your application, that they know your project, and that you can get them all of the information that they need so that they can get you a letter in a timely manner. Cleanup grant applications this year, there have been changes to their caps as well. There will be sort of 3 bands of funding. They're expected to give about 40 grants at the $500,000 level, about 25 grants at the $1 million level, and about 8 grants at the $2 million level. All of these will have that 4-year performance period, and you will indicate on your application which band you're applying for. And so it's my understanding, and the others can correct me if I'm wrong, but that they will be sort of reviewed in those batches. Multi-purpose grant applications. These, as I said at the beginning, we're kind of going up in level of capacity required to apply for and administer one of these grants. So a multi-purpose grant is best and recommended for communities that have identified already a discrete area that has one or more brownfield site in it. Under a multi-purpose grant, you can do a number of activities, including many of the activities that are allowable on other grant types, such as assessment and cleanup. Excuse me. And you are required to develop an overall plan for revitalization as part of that application as well. To apply for a multi-purpose grant, you must be the sole owner of at least one site within the target area by the time of application and where those cleanup activities will be conducted. And you must do at least one site assessment and remediate one site, as well as that overall plan for revitalization of the target area that I mentioned. If your target area already has a revitalization plan, you do not have to do another one, but you should discuss it in your application and work with your project officer to make sure that you've ticked that box appropriately. Eligibility for multi-purpose grants, again, very similar to all the others, and you should double check for specifics on some of these qualified community development agencies or collections of agencies that are eligible. Funding this year for multi-purpose is up to $800,000. There is no cost share requirement for these grants this year either. This period of performance is 5 years, and they expect to give out 17 of these awards. And if you apply for a multi-purpose grant, you cannot apply for an assessment grant or a cleanup grant in the same cycle. Finally, revolving loan fund grants. These grants capitalize revolving loan funds and allow for the money to be given back out either as loans primarily or sub-grants for cleanup activities. At least half of your award has to be used for loans and eligible programmatic costs associated with those loans. And only this year, only entities who do not have or are not part of another cooperative agreement for an RLF, so not a part of an RLF coalition, at the time of application are eligible for funds in this cycle. Eligibility is similar to what we've already discussed. The funding availability for community-wide revolving loan funds is up to $1 million per application. You can also apply for an RLF coalition for up to $1 million. That would require one lead applicant and one or more eligible partners. Once again, no cost share this year. A period of performance of 5 years, and an anticipated number of awards is at 10. If you do apply for an RLF, you cannot also apply for a cleanup grant or be a non-lead member of a different RLF coalition application. With that high-speed rail, I will hand it over to Kaylin at NJIT, who's going to go over some general application writing tips.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. I'm going to talk about general tips that apply to any and all of the grants that Carrie just talked about. First, let's talk about threshold criteria. You want to pay attention to this, which is pass or fail, and this means that they will stop reviewing if you are failing any of this criteria. And what's important to note this year is that the EPA is emphasizing that if you have procured a consultant and they're on board, named or not in your application, that consultant or contractor must have been procured via a fair competition process that's in compliance with their guidelines. So some general writing tips. You want to take the time to read the guidelines and FAQs. The EPA does go to great lengths to help any applicants by putting together these documents. But once the guidelines come out, the EPA can't answer your questions. So if you need help, reach out to your tab provider. Have the evaluation criteria in front of you when you write and proofread your sections. This is the boxed area in section 5 of the guidelines, and that is what the EPA reviewers will be checking when they're scoring your application. And the narrative criteria is more of the spirit of what they're looking for. You want to back up your claims with data and numbers, but if the data isn't available, then say that it's not available. And you want to make your story stand out. Ordinary does not get funded. So if you're stuck with this is just a good little writing tip. The technique is called the dragon in the city. You want to introduce your city, which in the technique is actually a metaphor, but here we're talking about an actual literal geographic area. So describe what is good and valuable about your city, but focus on talking about the dragons, which are the antagonists that are attacking your good city, like pollution, adverse health indicators, climate change, and anything else you can think of. Think about how it got this bad, what the impact is on the city and its people. And the brownfields are the heroes. So how can they be used to defend the city, attack the dragons, and what is the reward? Whatever narrative or story you choose to tell, make sure it's consistent throughout each section, and we will get more into the specifics on what should be included as the story unfolds throughout this presentation. So just some more general writing tips. Like I said before, you want to make sure that your application is cohesive. And reviewers will be looking for a theme that ties everything together. So you want to make sure your outcomes match your community needs. So don't say you need affordable housing and then the project is a park. You want to have an outside reviewer read your application, make sure everything flows. We tell everyone to double check all math, and good resource is to review previous year's successful applications. And we're going to tell you where to find those later on in this presentation. All right, so let's dive into it. I'm going to hand it over to Beth.
Sorry about that. I'm trying to unmute and get this started. Wow, that was fast. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Grigsby, and I represent Kansas State University TAB program. I am the Region 5 coordinator, but you can always come to me anytime. I've been in your shoes. I have worked for a municipality, I've worked for a nonprofit, but probably more pertinent would be the 13 years of grant writing for clients and developing their story and helping them. Actually, pretty successfully, we've been able to get quite a few grants. So now I'm not in that mode anymore, the grant writing, but I do review, as all the TAB providers do here. We do review your grant applications. Next slide, please. So this is a table that I put together. I thought it was interesting for project description because we're referencing geographic areas. So when you look at the geographic areas and how many target areas, each grant seems to have a different spin. So I thought that might be helpful for you. And as well, calling attention to the change in coalition, but also the structure of the coalition application, in that you do have to describe those coalition members. So that was just a spin that I had. Next slide, please. And here, just again, is kind of a map. If you see, and I'm not very creative, so I put a white square there around the city, and then the little red circle or oval is representing a target area. So the boundaries are important. in terms of geographic area. That's pretty much defining your area of work for the grant. And within this area, you do have to discuss the challenges and impacts within the boundary. So that's something to remember for the geographic piece. And then how will this grant address those challenges? And then as you look to the right here, the target area, you describe your corridor. Let's say in this case, it was a downtown district. But it is important to note things that are challenges in the area, back to challenges and impacts. It could be loss of population. It could be tax revenue decrease. It could blight abandoned properties. So you need to really lay out what those challenges are and how that grant will get you to where you want to be. Next slide, please. So here is just now, the EJ screen is a tool that I've used for the last several years as a grant writer. It is not required for the grant, and it is definitely a tool that it may not actually cover areas, rural areas or areas with sparse population. But most of the time when I've worked through it, I've found it's been very helpful. And here are the indexes, and kind of gives you an idea here of what you can draw on the map, how you can use it. Next slide, please. So here again, EJ screen data. What I'm trying to highlight here is it's really important if you drill down. So on the left side, we've got the city of Marion, Ohio, right? And they have a population of 35,000. But to the right, you see they're a block group that's defined. And that's the area where the priority brownfields was set. So then you get a printable standard report. So in this case, it would be 2 reports. Next slide, please. And you get data that helps you drill down to what the issues are. How is it that, you know, in that geographic area, what's a variation there? How is it in the brownfields area are the residents affected? And you see to the right here, which is the census block group data, you see to the right and you compare it to the percentile in the state, the last column, but you see low income is higher. You see unemployment rate higher. Under age 5, sensitive population higher. So these are things that you can use with your data. Next slide, please. The project area description and plans for revitalization. I want to get back to the project area description. You need to start this with a bang. You need to capture your reviewer's interest. If you're really dull and boring, it's probably going to carry throughout the whole application. So in this case, make sure that you are really gearing up and getting their attention. It sets the stage for the rest of the project. Clearly define your target areas. Quantify all the possible brownfields you can in this area. They are potential. They don't have to be on a list. And then describe the location. Are they proximal to a residential area? Well, how proximal? Are they 100 feet? Well, that's an issue. Check out your EJ indexes, your socioeconomic indicators, etc. Are the brownfield challenges, impacts described for the geographic boundary magnified in the target area? That was something that I was hoping to bring out with the discussion on city versus block group. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to read everything on the slides. Hopefully you get a copy of these slides, you go through them. I really just wanted to come up with some highlights here in discussion. So because we have so little time, unfortunately. So why is your site a priority? That's an important piece. Is it a significant health hazard? Is it an area, an abandoned site that attracts a magnet for crime, an issue in that neighborhood? Or is it an area maybe that's not secured? And the kids, you know, kids, they love to wander and they love to check things out. Is it in a floodplain? And if that's the case, make sure when you're talking about reuse, you're talking about the design to take into account the floodplain. What about the health issues? Tie impacts to health issues. And always remember your other factors. Next slide, please. And here again, going back to the EJ screen, and I think any of us could assist anyone if you want to play around or try to figure it out if you haven't before. But I'm not a technical person, so I was able to do it. And honestly, if I can do it, I think you can, hopefully. But this gives you, also shows off the ACS, the American Community Survey results. And in this case, the percent of Black population below poverty level. That's something you could show for your block group. Next slide, please. Priority brownfield description, again, very important. And this is an example, half-acre site, give you the operations in the past, what are the potential impacts, the soil, groundwater, and what other areas, not just residents, but the river, the size of the building, maybe asbestos, lead paint. It's a priority site because, and they lay that out very well here. Next slide, please. And then reuse should align with challenges. So you have a challenge, you're going to think about the reuse. Let's say in your particular area, you have unemployment, high unemployment. And the reason is because you have underskilled workers. Well, maybe the reuse, which would tie into your community plan, would also support workforce development, workforce training. Maybe it's lack of adequate housing that comes out in your plan. Well, how do you go about solving that issue? Possibly that reuse could be, affordable housing or mixed use. And a caveat, multipurpose has two options. Please pay attention to that. Cleanup, how the public and project partners, including that underserved community, involved in the development of that reuse strategy. And this is something that, as a tab provider now, I'm assisting a community with initiating the discussion with their underserved community, the residents in the area. So that's a tab service you could always tap into. Now would be a little late for this round, but you could always tap into that. Give us a call. Next slide, please. Here is an example. I thought it was good. References the plan, references the public outreach, references the type of populations that surround the site. Honestly, I thought it could have a bit more detail, but you only have so much space. And that's the issue. Too many target areas, you're not going to have enough space to do a really good job, because that target area, you're going to carry that through the entire application. Everything's pretty much related to that in your geographic area. Next slide, please. And I think I need to ask how I am on time from someone.
You are doing great, Beth.
Oh, okay.
You are
good.
well ahead. Take your time. You're doing great.
Well, I'll keep going then. So then we get into, again, what are the outcomes? What are the benefits of that reuse strategy? Focus on what's going to take place in the target area. What's going to benefit your disadvantaged populations? This is really important, but it's probably going to benefit the community at large. Do that. Discuss it. Something new this year, displacement of residents. That's huge. That is something, if that's taking place, you better have a strategy or a policy to abate it. We've given some examples of when it happens. Gentrification related to market changes. Strategies might be affordable housing for the folks that are displaced, or maybe for commercial entities, additional commercial leasing close to the TA. And then don't forget climate change, energy cost benefits, updated infrastructure. Think about the cost benefits of sustainable reuse of buildings. There's quite a bit. So you could just kind of keep playing on that. Next slide, please. Here is an example again, revitalization of the target area. I thought this was good because it talks about the overriding health and welfare of the citizens, but also in this particular case, it was huge 40 acres of landfill on the Ohio River. They are developing an urban park. It's addressing some huge issues in the area with 75,000 more trees to cool the neighbors, reduce the urban heat island effect, and these are things for vulnerable populations, the young and the old, low income. That's rough. So this was a good example. Next slide, please. And strategy for leveraging resources. Again, I'm not reading all the slide, but I don't overlook things like if you do pull tab in, hey, make sure you talk about that leverage resource you're using. Maybe in your application, you plan on working with tab on developing an outreach plan. These are important. And then always realize secured funding is going to be reviewed more favorably. And it's tough out there. It's really tough. A lot of competition. Next slide, please. And then cleanup grants. There's a new piece of that. The resources you need for site characterization. Boy, you better have that cleanup plan buttoned up tight, because there's going to be so much competition this year for that. So make sure that you're, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. Resources needed for site remediation, attached documentation. And when you go to resources needed for site reuse, again, attached documentation. It's an important piece. Consider all activities, including demolition, construction. And again, use of infrastructure. Next slide, please. And leveraging those resources, the use of existing infrastructure. List your infrastructure, but I think the key here is, what if you need those upgrades? How are you going to go about getting that? And that's another piece. I always see canned language with this, and it really shouldn't be that way. Here's another piece that if you don't have, you could write, if you don't have a plan, you can write that into your grant. Use those EPA planning documents, infrastructure evaluation, market studies. It goes on and on. Equitable development. Write that in. Show that you've thought it through. Next slide, please. And this is an example, and the examples I'm using are successful grant applications from the past. So these are relatively good. And what I liked about this was they talked about existing infrastructure at the priority sites, major selling feature for prospective developers. EPA wants to hear that type of thing. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'm done. So on to Nefeli, community need and community engagement.
Actually, I'm going to just jump in here real quick. Sorry, Nefeli, just 30 seconds. Dan, or my gosh, I'm spaced out. Dan or David, sorry. Our wonderful, who's ever, can you go to slide 39, please? I think it's actually Kaylin. So sorry, Kaylin. Beth, it's where we have a question about project area mentioning highlighting 5 priority sites for assessment applications for state and tribes. And I think I know where this person is going since I have spent a lot of time in these guidelines. So Beth, I think they're addressing 5 priority sites. And can you, because I think in the states and tribes specifically, you need to have at least 3 target areas and a minimum of 1 in each of those areas.
Right.
So that being the case, there might only be 3 priority sites, I think. Is that what?
Oh, in
my
the minimum of
understanding is-
5 priority sites, that's for assessment, state and tribes. Is that
Mhm.
not correct?
It's my
Or is it-
understanding is that is correct. It is 5 and at least 1 in each. So you can have
Oh.
more than 1 in some of them, but you have to have 5 total.
5 total. Got it. So now I
Ellie.
need to go and talk with some folks because it's interesting how this is one of the things I'm so glad people are bringing up questions, because one of the things that, having 6 tab providers is that we talk and we make sure that everyone is consistent as far as what we're also hearing from project officers across the country with EPA, because the guidelines change so much that getting that information out consistently is imperative. So you heard it here. Does that answer the question? If it doesn't, type something else in again. And Beth, since you're handing it over to Nefali, you can also address this question too. Okay.
They're
Thanks,
asking
guys.
they're asking for not state and tribe, and I can't type in the chat for some reason. So I'm gonna pull it up since I'm not talking.
They're asking for non-state and tribe, right? And that's where the additional sites come in. Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Cool.
Pull the guidelines
Okay.
while we're talking.
Right. Okay. So Nefali, we're back to slide 50. Community need and community engagement, and passing the baton to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. So this is actually the section here in community need and community engagement that is, I want to say, one of the most difficult sections of the narrative, and we see that actually most applicants lose points in this section right here, and especially in the community need. So this section,
Sally?
yes.
I'm not sure if it's just me. Is everybody getting a very bad echo?
Oh, really? Oh, no.
Yes, we are.
Okay, we're getting a very bad echo. Is there any chance you can change?
I can try to call in, but that will take some time. So, I don't know why is that. One second. Is it better now or the same echo?
It isn't.
How about we go to the next section 3, and I call in and I go back to
You
that.
can do that. The next section would be, look at that, would be mine. So we're going to jump to slide 67. Okay, guys, switch. And you know what? This is a great example of pivoting, right? And how many times we should just play a game, how many times somebody can say the word pivot during COVID, right? Well, we're going to say pivot here too. So task descriptions, cost estimates, measuring progress. This honestly should be a pretty easy section once you get here. You've swam your way through all the other sections, and now you're at task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. And these are important, so please do not think, oh, this is easy to do and I'm just going to slap anything in here. No, this is a lot of points. And as you've heard from everybody, these grants are awarded with 1 point difference. Okay, so next slide, let's get into this. So as I said, points are huge in each section, and this is no exception, okay? So there are 3 things, however, cost estimates and the development of the cost, right? They used to be separate, now they're consolidated. So if you're doing these applications and you send them to your tab providers for a review, and we see these in 2 separate situations, we're gonna know that you didn't read the guidelines, okay? So read the guidelines and make sure you are not working off a previous application, okay? So really, really important. The reviewer will know right away that you didn't do your homework, okay? And you don't want that. As Beth said, you got to keep that story going, right? That dragon story that Kaylin talked about. You got to keep their interest. You got to let them know that you know this, you want this, and you got the lingo down. So you can see here the percentages, the arrows have turned to boxes, have jumped, and these are just as important here, but same thing in the project area description for cleanup grants, very important, that also went up. So the next slide, let's just get into this. So tasks, when we're talking about tasks, right, in this whole thing, we're talking about what, how, when, who, and the metrics, right? It's not good enough to just say project manager, right? Or this person or that. You need specifics. So what are you actually doing? And I would recommend don't make it complicated. Just like Beth had said, don't have too many target areas. You just can't do it. The tasks, let me remind everybody that what you write in your grant and when you secure your grant, that will essentially be your work plan. Okay, that basically is your roadmap of how you are going to implement your grant, right? So the tasks that you put in here are essentially setting you up for your budget, right? So keep it simple. Keep it simple, concise, direct, clean, very clean, okay? So here are some examples. I'm not going to read the slide, right? But we're getting into the implementation. How are you going to do it? So you got your task, program management, implementation. How are you going to do this? We are going to develop the program by doing this, right? We're going to procure for QEP. We're going to manage it, blah, 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 right? Okay, action verbs, schedule, when. Okay, I get this all the time. EPA wants a date. They're not asking for November 12th in 2023. They're not asking for specifics, but you're going to say by second quarter of fiscal year, blah, 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 we will have procured a QEP, right? Qualified environmental professional, right? That sort of thing, okay? You got a plan in your head, right? You're going to know how to execute, right? Who's doing this? Who is doing each task, right? The QEP, the consultant, the community, the nonprofit who's doing the participating cost, right? Outputs, metrics, okay? What are you actually, so outputs are numbers, things, right? The activities that lead to the outcomes, two separate things, right? So quarterly reports, final reports, right? The federal financial reports, the meeby-weeby reports, right? So next slide, we're going to get into an example, right? This is a fabulous one. Okay, this I believe came from Trinidad. In Colorado, this came from a cleanup grant. It's very clean, concise, and doesn't take up a lot of real estate in your grant, right? Those 10 pages or 12 pages are really important real estate, okay? It's just like a film script. If you can take it out, then it was never really that important, right? You still have your story, but you took it out, then that was just words on the page, right? So this is saying right there, task 1, task 2, grant management, community outreach. Who's the lead? Boom, boom. You can really see what's going on, and this makes the reviewer's life so much easier. Like, you've got their attention, they can see everything, and they're like, yeah, this is really clean. They got it together, right? It communicates, we know what we're doing with this grant, okay? Next slide. Okay, so cost estimates. So we get this a lot, right? Will we get lower points if we have personnel? The short answer to this is no one can really answer that question. If you need it, put it in. If you need that capacity, put it in. You just have to justify it, right? But make sure you're not putting too much there, okay? Everything has to be justified no matter what you're asking for, okay? If they're not reasonable or realistic, that is definitely going to be a red flag and a detracted, okay? So estimates for each task, right? If you're going to the conference and you're saying 2 people at this much, you know, the hotel, this, that, okay, it's going to be $3,000. And they're like, okay, we got that, okay? Be specific. Supplies, don't just willy-nilly the supplies number, okay? They'll know that. Realistic, you know, and implementable, right? If it doesn't make sense, it needs to pass the sniff test, right? Okay, and correlation to the task. So let's look at the actual, an actual example. So next slide. Okay, so basically here, you're going to see that you've got a very easy budget, right? It's an easy budget, 4 tasks, and there's zeros, right? We're not seeing $10,000 and 618, right? No, okay. Keep it very simple. Nobody's asking you to get too specific here, right? And then make sure, I know Beth or Kaylin, we're all saying this, please make sure that your columns add up vertically, horizontally, they make sense. if you're going to skip down and say like a subtotal, make sure you bold that so it just doesn't look like a bunch of numbers running all together and something is not supposed to be adding up, right? Just make that very clear for the reviewer, that everything just adds up and doesn't, the ESAs, and as you can see here, it's 548,000. The cleanup planning, there's community engagement. And I will say this cost estimate, I put this one in because this year, they're really focusing on community engagement and planning, right? The participatory support costs, right? They're really emphasizing that, right? So make sure you look at community engagement, the percentage of the entire funds, and see how much is in each task. If it's really heavy in task 3, the ESAs, the cleanup, right? And yet you have all this other community outreach and planning that you want to do, and it only represents, less than 5% of the grant, you might want to think that through again, okay? Next slide. Okay, again, really clean, right? But the budget that you saw on the slide before, when you see these slides again, you will see that this matches perfectly to the budget above. And it's very simple and it takes up very limited real estate. Okay, that's what you want. You don't want to drone on for paragraphs. However, you don't want to misuse a chart and take up a huge amount of space. If you can say it narratively, say it narratively. Like this one is a bit of both, right? Narrative and using bold, and you still have, here's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's our 4 tasks. There are the budgets, 12, 10, 4, 548, and 30, right? I can pull those out like this. If your reviewer has to look for those numbers, that's going to drive them a little crazy, okay? So the next slide is measuring progress, okay? So now we're through 2 of the 3. So here on measuring progress. Okay, very easy. It's simple. It's not easy, it's simple. Tracking, measuring, and evaluating, right? How do you evaluate things? You need metrics. How are you going to track things? How are you going to measure them? This is what EPA wants to know. Hey, how are you going to track your wins, your interim wins, your interim successes? Well, we're going to do it by letting you know when we're going to have meetings, and we're going to have 4 annually, and we're going to have minutes, and we're going to have a task force, and we're going to have these quarterly reports, annual reports, right? Statistics, data, blah, 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 right? All those things. That's how we're going to measure whether we are moving the needle. If you can't tell me how you're going to move the needle and measuring your progress, the reviewer isn't, they're going to just be like, this is just going to run around, but nobody's going to really know if things are really moving in the right direction, right, with the grant. So if you go to the next slide, right, let's talk about 2 things, and that is outputs and outcomes, right? Outputs are those action items that get you to the outcomes, which is the value, right? The value add. So short and long term, because interim successes are just as important as long-term successes, right? And a lot of your cleanup grants are not really going to tell EPA, right? You're going to clean up this, but eventually the bigger outcome is going to happen long after the grant has been closed, right? But don't be modest here, right? And make sure that, when you're talking about quarterly progress reports, that if you have a 4-year grant, do the math, right? How many quarterly reports are you going to have in a 4-year time frame, right? How many annual reports are you going to have? Speak the lingo, talk, make sure that it's not just the obligatory, this many phase 1s and this many phase 2s. They've heard that, they know that. They're looking for that application that is going to stand out, okay? So how do you do that, right? That's what you're looking for, the secret sauce, right? So having said that, I'm going to pass it. Nefeli, should we try to see if your microphone's working?
You hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Great.
Without the
Fabulous.
echo? Okay.
Okay,
Let's
now
try
we
it
just
again.
now we have to go back to slide 50. Wonderful. And with that, I will hand back the baton, literally.
All right. Thank you, Dylan. And thank you for jumping in and doing, you did the, the section 3. That was great. So with respect to the, section 2, the community need, the community engagement, as I was saying, this is, let's say, the most problematic, let's say, section of the narrative proposal. And we've seen that, many applicants have, trouble, like, putting the data together that you need essentially to articulate the need that your community has. So next slide, please. So within that section, essentially, you have 2 different parts. One is the community need, and then you have to talk about how you plan to engage the community. And within the community need, and I'll start talking about a few tips here on how to put like a compelling narrative together. You have to talk about, first of all, what is your community's need for funding, which has to do with the financial and socioeconomic indicators to demonstrate that you actually have a need, right? And this is not the section where you can be like modest, or you can say, for example, that, we're doing great. No, you have to say that, okay, we need the funds. We need the funds because we have X, Y, Z, issues in the community, and we definitely need those funds to make, things change. So you really have to demonstrate, how much you need the funds because you're unable to draw resources from other, your budget, or, if you're a town, a municipality, or a nonprofit. And then that is the first part, and I'll talk a little bit more about where you can find the data and what kind of like data you need here. And then the next one has to do with threats to sensitive populations. So that goes beyond, let's say, the financial, socioeconomic. It has to do with the health disparities that you might have in your community. And you have to, again, you have to demonstrate that there is, there are several issues within the community that could be socioeconomic, could be environmental, could be health burdens. And you have to, again, articulate that need and, that how your community is impacted with, and you have to back this up with actually, data that come from valid sources, and be careful about that. Here you need data that you can actually cite and say, for example, we got this, statistics from this particular data set. You cannot kind of like, use data that you find randomly, let's say, in like Google. And one very important thing here is to mention that, sure, we have, those needs, right? But how this grants, proposal, how this, this funds would essentially help you alleviate some of the issues. And here, be careful a little bit about that. When you're making that link between, okay, what is that, the need, and how, the grant is actually, is going to help. Please don't say that you're going to solve, world hunger here with, with an assessment or cleanup grant, but make it a little bit, something closer to, okay, well, with this fund, we'll assess, these properties, we'll clean up these properties, and we are going to remove blight from the community, right? So something that is tangible. Next slide, please. Now, your tools. So as Beth mentioned, before, the EPA's EJ screen, of course, it's not recommended for the proposal, but it's going to be your friend. Because this is a platform that you can actually use to get data, demographic, and environmental. Actually, some of the health parameters have been incorporated there to basically, screen your community and help, let's say, develop your narrative. Besides the EPA screen, we also have a new tool that is called the Climate and Economic Justice Screen tool. Is currently at a beta version. And essentially with that tool, you can actually identify which communities are characterized as disadvantaged. So EJ Screen would not tell you that. EJ Screen will give you the statistics, would give you the indicators, but it doesn't have that classification, let's say, that characterization. So if your community is, let's say, characterized as disadvantaged by that Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, which is a federal tool, definitely mention that in your application. And besides that, I mean, we also have other data sources, Environ Atlas. It has more than 500 environmental maps. It really has a lot of data. And of course, you know, the American Community Survey, you can include some like demographics and economic and social and other type of data. Next slide, please. Now, additional data sets. So with respect to the public health data that you might need for your narrative, and I'll talk exactly about, you know, the types of like information that you might need. You might also want to search CDC's National Environmental Public Health Tracking Network that has data at the census tract level, such cancer, asthma, and also the places. So all the information I'm providing in the slides, everything, like all the different data sources have a link. So when you get, you know, the slides and the PowerPoint, click on that link and that will prompt you to the actual website, which has the database. Of course, the state resources. So each state would have a Department of Public Health, right? This is really one of the best sources for you to search in terms of like, you know, public health data that you might need. So definitely, you know, look for that, you know, website, and also, you know, if you have local health departments, they also may have, you know, public health data. Next slide, please. Now, with respect to the community's need for funding, and as I mentioned before, really briefly here you have to talk about how you're not, let's say, able to draw other resources to cover that assessment of or cleanup of the brownfield site. So it's really important that you communicate the financial, let's say, burdens of your community. I mean, if you're a town or like a municipality in general, you can mention a couple of things with respect to, for example, you know, the tax base or property values or things like that. If you are a nonprofit, then you can also mention a few things that are specific, let's say, to your organization. Two key things here that you should definitely talk about. If you are a small community, which means less than 10,000 residents, definitely talk about that. And if you have low income populations at the geographic area or even at the target area, so that is something else that you want to think about when you're developing the narrative. What kind of like area to let's say mention demographics, right? So, and the answer to that is you have to cherry pick and see what makes more sense with respect to, well, if I have a block group of low income populations within the town and I have several sites within the block group, I definitely want to mention that, right? So keep in mind that you want to kind of like cherry pick some of the demographics to articulate again that need. Next slide, please. So you really want to make a case, right? How much you need the funds. And I know that many of especially the municipalities, are having a hard time showing that in the narrative because, you know, you don't really want to say anything bad about your community, right? You don't really want to say that, oh, we're not doing well, we're struggling, you know, we have, you know, certain issues. But in order to get awarded, in order to get the funds, this is what you have to do. And if you see from like, you know, successful examples, and actually KSU has a great database with previous successful proposals, everybody has to articulate that need. So please, you know, don't feel that you're not, let's say, advertising your community. That's not the right section, right? To be shy and to be like, okay, well, no, we're doing okay. You really want to say here that, no, we are not okay. And essentially, there are a few things that you could mention in that first part of the community need, right? We talked about low-income populations. We talked about small communities. Then again, if you're a municipality, loss of tax base, right? Changes in the milling rate, changes in the grant list, property values, lack of investment, if you have unemployment, if your median household income is lower, if you have a significant, let's say, percentage of SNAP recipients within your town, you want to mention that. And for states and tribes, for essentially, you know, for the assessment grants that are targeting states and tribes, here you have to mention that the communities you plan to serve do not have the capacity to have their own grant. So that is, again, that is a parenthesis, only applicable for the states and tribes assessment grant. Next slide, please. Now here, I know that the text is very dense, but this is essentially from a previous successful cleanup proposal. I just wanted to show you, how we put together a compelling, let's say, narrative, how we actually compare, and something else. You need to compare your data with the rest of the area, right? So if you have a town, you want to compare this with a state and say, okay, we're doing worse than the state. So you're making a case, or we're doing worse than the, than the region, or we're doing worse than the rest of the country. Now, I've seen that in many cases, this doesn't, sometimes, you cannot find the data, right? We're doing well, and, compared to the state, we are in a better position. What are you going to do then? Well, find something else within, for example, if you're doing worse than the neighboring town, example, or if you have certain block groups or certain census tracts within your community that are doing worse than the rest of the town. Kind of like, make those comparisons so that you kind of like twist this in your favor. This is what you have to do. Next slide, please. Now, with respect to the community need, we talked about the financial part, right? Now we have to talk about the threats to sensitive populations. First of all, when we talk about sensitive populations, we have to understand, we have to say, okay, do we have sensitive populations within our target area? So sensitive populations, we consider, for example, people of color, right, minorities, low-income populations, of course, seniors like children, but you can also expand this to veterans, to people with disabilities, and how to find this data. Essentially, ED Screen has a wealth of information there with respect to those parameters, but also the American Community Survey, you can definitely, find information on veterans and people with disabilities. Next slide, please. Now, if you have sensitive populations there, what are kind of like the threats? Right? So first of all, why do we need to mention sensitive populations? Sensitive populations will be more vulnerable, right, to the environmental threats and with my experience, higher, let's say, health impacts. So we want to make that connection that we have the sensitive populations in our town. And on top of that, we actually have, health and welfare concerns, right? We want to see, what is the threat really here? So with respect to the health and the welfare, we have to talk, first of all, on a qualitative manner, like kind of like, describe the blight, right, the vandalism, the safety issues, but also the quantitative part, which has to do with, okay, we have unemployment rates, we have critical service jobs. And here on the right, I'm giving you several examples with respect to like what kind of data you need to include here. SNAP benefits, poverty level. So that is kind of like, the high, let's say, high level overview of the type of like information that you need to include there. Next slide, please. Within that component of the threats to sensitive populations, there is a paragraph where you have to explain if you have greater than normal incidence of disease and in general adverse health conditions. And there are three types of like sources, three types of data that you need to mention here. One has to do with low life expectancy. Second has to do with heart disease and asthma, right? And for also something that I haven't included here, lead poisoning as well. So now to be able to make that connection between, right, brownfield, the presence of brownfields, right, the sensitive populations, the greater than normal, incidence of disease. So here you have to approach this in a certain way where you can say, well, sure, we have those sensitive populations, and we also see, higher rates, for example, of cancer, or you see, higher rates of like, heart disease. And again, here, something very important is that don't mention every single data point that you find. Mention only the ones that make sense. And by, what do I mean by make sense? the ones that actually will make a case of like why you need the fund. So if you're doing, let's say, if you have, let's say, asthma rates that are lower, for example, than the state, they don't mention that, right? So again, that cherry picking is really important. Next slide, please. And here, I mean, I'm not going to talk really about EJ Screen. Beth really covered, all of that. I just want to mention that EJ Screen could be, of course, your best friend, but in the beginning could be a little bit overwhelming to kind of like familiarize yourself with like how we actually get the data, how do we go down to block groups, census tracts, right, cities or the county. So just to point out, we have a webinar that was recorded. We did a webinar that was recorded last week. So if you want to learn more about like how to use EJ Screen, please click on that link on the screen that says you can tab webinar. And that is essentially a half-hour webinar that goes into detail of like, how to actually get, the reports and how to use the data for your narrative. Next slide, please. Now, last component with respect to environmental justice. So two things here. First of all, any environmental justice indexes, please mention those. These are from EJ Screen, and this is a combination of demographics and environmental indicators. So essentially, you want to mention that how this grant, right, will be promoting environmental justice. So you want to say, okay, well, I have certain environmental justice issues in the area. You have to mention that. And this is how this grant will help with that. So you need, again, to use hard data on like what are the disadvantaged, populations, right? And what are the EJ populations by using those EJ indexes. Next slide, please. And just to quickly mention something about the climate and economic justice screening tool. For that particular area of the grant, let's say, if you go to that tool and see that, your census tract is, let's say, identified as disadvantaged, definitely mention that here. And you can, when you click on your census tract and it says, for example, is the census tract disadvantaged, then it gives you the different categories that the climate and economic justice screening tool has. And this is really a sophisticated tool because it goes beyond, the socioeconomic, right? It includes environmental, energy, and health burdens. So definitely, I definitely recommend that you click on that link. I think it's an easier tool than EJ Screen. So definitely click on that and play, around with the data there. Next slide, please. Community engagement. So that is the second part, essentially, of Section 2. And it has three main components, right? What is going to be the project involvement, right, and the project roles, and what's going to be essentially, the key stakeholders that it will be involved in the project, and how you plan to incorporate their input, right, and the input of the community. Next slide, please. So when we talk about project involvement, right, and bringing together different partners, you have to look at different levels. At the local level, the regional level, the state level, and engage, for example, different stakeholders. It could be from the municipal departments, economic development, right, public health, environmental groups that you might have in the community, any local community organizations. So that is really important. And of course, right, it goes to the general public. And some examples that you might be thinking, okay, what kind of like local organizations I have in my community? Look into the faith-based organizations, definitely engage them. Another one, it could be the Chamber of Commerce, right? So some things are, let's say, these examples are not the first thing that comes into your mind, right? But it could be really, really helpful to engage all of them. It could be the local health department or any other citizen groups that you might have in your community. Next slide, please.
Nefeli, I'm looking at the time we're running out of, but the next two slides are about project roles and incorporating community input, which great job. but we're going to need to jump to programmatic costs, and people can look at your slides, which are chock full, guys, chock full of stuff. So awesome information. But we only have 14 minutes left, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we need to jump to programmatic capability, and Kaylin will be talking now. So awesome job. Any other parting words, Nefeli? Any other little tidbits?
I apologize for running late.
It's okay.
was
We
a little
got
bit
mixed up
excited.
with everything and we had to bounce around. So timing got a little squirrely, but we're going to jump now to programmatic capability, but everybody check out the slides about project roles and incorporating community input. Really great information. Thanks so much, Nefeli.
Okay.
Caitlin?
I'll be quick. This is the last section here. We're going to talk about programmatic capability and past performance. Okay, so EPA is putting a little more emphasis on this section this year, and you want to focus attention on how you will manage the grant and project. You want to, same themes, same things basically Joelle was talking about with the specificity. You want to identify the key staff, their experience, expertise, what specific roles they'll play in the management of this work. And check to see if the roles that you're defining support the program and the tasks that you've described in the previous section 3. Think about management, financial reporting, any checks and balances, and how you're going to work together as a team towards a common goal. And you should show that you have support and resources. It's a team effort, but there's a potential pitfall here. Remember what I said about if you're going to name contractors, consultants, just make sure that your procurement process complies with their solicitation clauses. I'll give you like 2 seconds to read these boxes here. Basically, these are just examples of what you might put in. The one on the left is too general, too vague. EPA wants to see something more like the one on the right that has names, years of experience, and what each role is. Okay, I'm just gonna jump to the next section here, which is past performance. This section is pro forma, which, just answer the questions. This isn't the time for storytelling, forget your dragon, forget your hero. No, just kidding. But you want to toot your own horn here. Don't give more than 3 examples. And if you've received EPA Brownfields funds in the past, use those. But if not, describe how you've managed other projects with a similar scope and tie in the type of funding that you're requesting. Again, consider using a table to save space, make things more organized, make sure you're checking all those boxes, include the funding source, amount, how it was used, and the specific outputs and outcomes, and know the difference between those two. And because those are your measures of success along with your compliance record. And pay attention to the or here. And by that I mean address all the criteria, look at the guidelines. If you have no history of receiving a grant in the past, then say that. You'll get 8 points for that. But if you don't say anything, you'll get a 0. So I just have one more example. Here you'll see the one on the right is a lot more organized. It's easier to read. You're being nice to your reviewer there. And that's what they'd like to see. Okay, let's kind of introduce ourselves and our programs. Beth, you're up.
Yes. Okay, so technical assistance to Brownfields community, that's who we are. We're here for you. And hopefully we can help you. Next slide. And examples on our websites, examples of previous successful MARC grant applications. This is over a period of years. So make sure you check that out, but do not grab text from these and use it as canned language. Not good, not good. The tab easy, near and dear to my heart, grant writing software tool. We'll talk about that briefly. And then the review of your grant application. So that's an important piece. And actually, even as a grant writer, I would encourage my communities to take my grant to tab for a review. It's excellent. Next slide, please. So here's Tab Easy Online Grant Writing Tool, and we'd be very happy to help you. But the key to this is why I really like this is you have a template for your grant, which is very important. It's already updated for funding year 23. It includes reminders and helpful hints and links to resources. Next slide, please. And this is an example, just an example that I've drawn up of how threshold criteria can vary by grant. As you notice, our outline here indicates what that change might be, how it varies. Next slide, please. And this is just an overview of the screen. What I like about this is you've got everything. You've got the grant criteria request, you've got the evaluation criteria, as well as you could go to helpful hints. You can take all this information if you like, you can export it to Word, and maybe you only want the outline. We'll do the outline by Word, but it helps you make sure that you're paying attention to all the criteria you need to respond to. Next slide, please. And so we have all of our tab service providers with their links. Regions 5, 6, 7, and 8 is KSU. And we'll just go on and let everybody introduce themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, take it away here.
So with respect to Region 1, we are supporting reviews for communities. We have 2 rounds of reviews with deadlines of October 25th. For the first round of review, you can send your draft, you can provide feedback and how your draft addresses EPA's guidelines. And then the next one would be on November 8th. So you can actually, when you update your draft, you can send it back to us and we can provide a second level overview. And with that, I'll pass it on to Kaylin with Region 2.
Hey, thank you. So I'm with NJIT tab. We service Region 2, which is New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands. So if that applies to you, reach out to us. We'd be happy to review any grant we receive by November 8th. And next up is West Virginia. Do we still have Carrie? Oh, okay.
I'm here. Hi. So WVU tab will also be reviewing grants, and we will take those through November 1st. And similar to UConn, we also ask that you provide those in a Word document or editable format, because we will provide inline comments and suggestions, and you can send those to the email here. And I think that's my only slide, but I'm not sure. Oh, and we do have other resources, and you can also email that same email address to ask about help for all Brownfields things non-grant related.
Great. And I think, Clark Henry, I thought I saw, not to put you on the spot, Clark, but I am. I saw that you were in the participants, so I'm not sure if you can speak or not, but Clark Henry is here in attendance. So if you can't speak, Clark, can you? Okay, I gave you 5 seconds, sorry. But Clark, if you're in Region 4, the deadline is November 1st, and please contact
Hello?
them. They're great. Hey, there you are, Clark.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yep.
Fabulous. I can't turn on my my camera, but if you guys are in Region 4, reach out to me. So we do a lot of the same stuff that the other tab providers are doing. We can review your proposals that you're putting together now, help you with stakeholder engagement, some planning, figure out how to kind of walk through this maze. And, we have team members from engineering to capacity building and brownfield folks that have walked this path several times. So we know we can hold your hand and do trainings. And also something we like to do is try to help you understand how to leverage brownfield redevelopment, even absent EPA resources. So there's a lot you can do without the grants to help encourage this to happen. And get people, property owners, developers, investors, community members on board, so you can tap this awesome resource at EPA in the next few years.
Thanks, Clark.
Okay, well, thank you, Clark. That was great. And we do quite a bit of the same type of work. Here is a schedule for our MARC draft grant applications. We do serve EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. Our review and comments are provided less than 3 working days, and believe me, we stick to that one. And then it's a first come, first serve. November 15th will be the last day, because then you really need to get your applications in soon. And Maggie Bellinger is the person to schedule that review with. Next slide, please. All right, Claire.
Thanks, Beth. Ditto with everything that everybody has said. Okay, so we're all here to help with tailored assistance and redevelopment strategy and capacity building, just what Clark had said. You know, we've all been in this arena for a while, so we will take your deadline, you know, your grants up to the deadline of November 22nd. However, keep in mind, though, the closer that you get to the deadline, the quality of incorporating those comments gets lower and lower and lower, right? And the stress gets higher and higher and higher. So the quality of the grant will absolutely come through. And like Beth said, we try to turn them around as quickly as possible, usually in a couple of days. But we will try. Depends what the complex of the complexity of the grant. So next slide. We also provide with our reviews a red line, and we use a rubric that goes by and scores you, if you will, to let you know whether you are hitting the mark or just completely missing it. Okay, so think big, dream big, and start early, but it is almost a month away. All right. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Kaylin, I believe, for available tab resources. And thank you, Kaylin.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Here's just some useful websites and resources. You heard us say over and over again, make sure you read the grant guidelines and the FAQs. Here are the links. I've seen in the Q&A, you're not going to be able to click the links here, but once we get this presentation out to you on ksutab.org, you'll be able to access all the links, as well as the Tab Easy program. And just for a final note, thank you all for joining us and hearing what we have to say. Good luck, and now you know who to reach out to if you have any more questions. I believe we've been answering everything that's been coming through in the Q&A, but feel free to drop some more questions.
The mad rush.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think everybody did a great job. Thank you, EPA. Without their funding and support, none of us could be doing what we do, and we're all very passionate. So, and a big kudos to Kaylin and NJIT for hosting this and doing all the background work. So thank you so much. Anybody else want to say anything?
Somebody else sent us a chat, and I had planned on jumping in here. We didn't really talk about the sort of grants.gov of it all, but grants.gov is where you'll be applying, and it will be down for regularly scheduled maintenance the weekend before the deadline. And you may have noticed that the deadline is 2 days before a holiday. So you typically get a confirmation within 48 hours, but there will be a holiday mixed in there if you apply on deadline date. So just keep all of these things in mind when you're planning your schedule for application. And also keep in mind regarding requirements for community notification on your cleanup grant, that if you submit early, then you must have had your notification 2 weeks before when you submit, not 2 weeks before the deadline. So make sure that you're scheduling that meeting in such a way that you don't get messed up. I've heard urban lore of folks getting hung up by that threshold criteria in previous years. So your tab provider can help clarify that if you have specific questions. But these are like, we don't want you to get kicked out for these silly little things. So make sure that you're paying attention to those dates.
Carrie, I think that's fact. That's not lore. That is absolutely, that 14-day has gotten many an applicant. So be very, very wary of that. I just wanted to mention that EPA is still available to talk about threshold criteria and eligibility. They can't talk about your project, but absolutely, if you have a question about eligibility, you need to go to your project office, the program officer in that region. Okay. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Have a great day and happy writing.
Thank you, everyone. Reach out. If
Absolutely.
you have questions, reach out to your tabbers.